Two nations, two political systems, two ideologies. In the epic contest between capitalism and communism, only one would prevail.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent.
The standoff divided Europe and engulfed the world.
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Marked by confrontation, might, and maneuvering.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over.
Punctuated by anxiety, paranoia, and fear.
But will still be one communist, two Americans.
Two civilizations, one epic question. Would the rivals destroy each other or find common ground and survive the Cold War?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
It was July 1945. Harry S. Truman was bound for Europe at a meeting of the Grand Alliance, the coalition of the three leading Allied powers of World War II. The American president was poised between two of history's greatest battles, the World War that was ending and the Cold War that would replace it. Monumental issues confronted Truman and his wartime partners. The control of defeated Germany, post-war boundaries, winning the war with Japan, securing a lasting peace for Europe.
There's not one piece of territory or one thing of a monetary nature that we want out of this war. We want peace and prosperity for the world as a whole.
Victory over Germany had restored peace to Europe, but it was already threatened by a growing rift between the partners themselves. At the Potsdam Conference, President Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill were on one side of the divide, determined to secure political freedom and democratic governments throughout post-war Europe. Their partner, the dictator of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, had other plans. He was determined to dominate all of Europe and impose communism on its nations. The Allies had won the war, but their alliance would not survive the peace. Historic differences would prove too great to overcome. The bitter rivalry had its roots in the years of the First World War, when the competing ideas of communism and liberal democracy first came into conflict. Beginning in 1914, World War I consumed Europe in killing and destruction. For the Western powers, the war was hell. For the Russian army, it was pure hell, 20 times over. Sent to fight without food, without ammunition, sometimes even without weapons, the demoralized soldiers were a human sacrifice to the war gods, offered up by a corrupt imperialist ruler, Russia's Tsar Nicholas II. At home, the Tsar urged his subjects to work harder, eat less, support the doomed war effort. By 1917, the Russian people were tired of the war, tired of starving, and tired of their Tsar. In February of that year, a public demonstration for a higher bread ration escalated into a popular rebellion. Tsar Nicholas was overthrown and imprisoned. A new government came to power, They promised democratic elections, new freedoms, equal rights for women.
A revolution belongs to the people. I propose to defend it against any attack, whether from the left or from the right.
Russia's flirt with democracy would be short-lived. In Switzerland, an exiled Russian named Vladimir Lenin was planning his own revolution, based on the writings of the German philosopher Karl Marx. Living in 19th century England, Marx witnessed firsthand the growing disparity between the rich and the poor. He predicted that the inequities of the capitalist system would inspire a spontaneous revolution of the modern working class, the proletariat. Capitalism would be replaced by a system of social and economic equality called communism.
We declare openly that our ends can only be achieved by the forcible overthrow of all social conditions.
Lenin interpreted Marx's beliefs with religious and violent fervor. He returned to Russia to lead a group called the Bolsheviks and condemned the new government.
They imagine that serious political questions are decided by voting. As a matter of fact, they are decided by class war.
In October 1917, Lenin launched his revolution and seized control of Russia. He and his band of comrades then set about establishing their workers' paradise, the modern Soviet socialist state. Bank accounts and personal property were confiscated. Private fields became collectivized farms. Stores and businesses were surrendered to the state. Lenin was intolerant of dissent and totally ruthless. Arrest without charge, imprisonment without trial, disappearance without explanation. All became routine. In the United States, President Woodrow Wilson followed events in Russia with growing unease. He had committed his nation to World War I in order that the world be made safe for democracy. In his 14 points address to Congress, he outlined how to achieve his lofty goals based on principles of national self-determination, free trade, and international cooperation. But the president's vision for the future did not include the Bolsheviks. Instead, when civil war broke out in Russia in 1919, Wilson sent troops to fight against Lenin's government. And in England, a young Winston Churchill urged swift action. Before the House of Commons, he declared, "We must strangle the infant Bolshevism in the cradle." Such rhetoric convinced Lenin and his comrades, including Joseph Stalin, that the West would stop at nothing to destroy their communist dream. Nearly 3 decades later, the battling ideologies remained bitterly opposed, and Potsdam did nothing to bridge the divide. President Truman called on Stalin to withdraw his troops from Eastern and Central Europe and to hold the free elections he had promised. Stalin refused. The region was a buffer zone, he said, and essential to his nation's security. The president was unconvinced. In his diary, he condemned the Soviet dictator for running a
police government, plain and simple. A few top hands just take clubs, pistols, and concentration camps and rule the people on the lower level.
But Truman had a trump card. His nation had developed an entirely new class of weapon. It was destined to win the war with Japan, but it would also provide leverage in dealing with people like Stalin. If it worked, Truman noted, I'll certainly have a hammer on those boys. On the first day of the Potsdam Conference, a blinding flash seared the New Mexico desert, ushering in the atomic age. The Manhattan Project had produced the world's first nuclear explosion. For the father of the bomb, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the awesome sight summoned the words of the Hindu god Vishnu. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. president gave his final go-ahead to drop the bomb on Japan. "Release when ready," he wrote. When Stalin learned that the city of Hiroshima had been destroyed by the American bomb, it came as no surprise. His spies within the Manhattan Project had long ago revealed its existence. But Truman's willingness to use the weapon presented a stark new reality for the Soviet leader. In a war fought with atomic bombs, his mighty Red Army would be rendered impotent. "The balance has been destroyed," he would later tell the scientists working on the Russian bomb. "That cannot be." Potsdam was the first and final meeting between Stalin and Truman, and set the tone for the early Cold War. In the words of one British diplomat, it was a very bad-tempered conference. As President Truman sailed for home, he could scarcely have imagined the decades of Cold War that lay ahead. There would be no Pearl Harbor in this coming struggle, no sudden attacks or declarations of war, just a growing sense of fear and distrust, pulling the former Allies toward a confrontation that neither could afford, but that neither would manage to escape.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin...
In 1946, Winston Churchill raised the alarm, warning that tyranny was once again on the march in Europe.
And all these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow.
Churchill's words drew criticism on both sides of the Atlantic. Neither the British nor the American people were ready for another war. But in the months since Potsdam, the Soviet Union was behaving more like an enemy than an ally. Joseph Stalin's Red Army had projected his authority throughout Eastern Europe. Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the eastern zone of Germany had come under the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. This was Stalin's buffer zone, assurance against future invasions. Initially, Stalin handpicked candidates to join coalition governments in these countries, but slowly all opposing factions were eliminated until only the hardline communists remained. Many Eastern Europeans fled to escape the coming storm. Millions of others were forcibly deported. Scenes of mass expulsions were seared into the mind of one American intelligence officer. 27 boxcars packed and heading east to the Soviet work camps. Stalin continued to test the limits of the World War II Grand Alliance. He warned his people that war with the West was inevitable. Washington was at a loss to explain the hostility. What did the Soviet leader want? Were his ambitions limitless? The best answer came from George F. Kennan, who had spent years observing the Kremlin as an American diplomat stationed in Moscow. In an 8,000-word dispatch to Washington, now known as the Long Telegram, Kennan deciphered the Soviet riddle. At the bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is the traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity, he said. Stalin needed to present the outside world as hostile and menacing in order to justify his own bloody regime. This didn't mean that the Soviets desired war with the West, Kennan emphasized. Soviet leaders may be impervious to the logic of reason, but they would be highly sensitive to logic of force and would back down if confronted with strong resistance. A year later, writing under the pseudonym X, Kennan proposed a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Kennan's idea of containment formed the basis of American Cold War policy for the next 50 years. Before long, it was put to the test. In 1947, the British announced that they could no longer afford to support the pro-Western governments of the Mediterranean in their fight against communism. If the U.S. could not take up the burden, the whole region was in danger of falling under communist rule. The Truman administration responded decisively. On March 12, 1947, the president went before a joint session of Congress to request aid for the countries of Greece and Turkey. The address sent a clear message to the Soviet Union.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
The president's appeal was quickly dubbed the Truman Doctrine. It represented a dramatic change in U.S. foreign policy, but it merely laid the groundwork for what followed. A month later, Secretary of State George C. Marshall traveled to Europe. He witnessed firsthand the physical ruin, social disintegration, and economic collapse left by the war. Marshall warned that under these conditions, Europeans would turn to communism as an alternative to starvation and death. 2 months later, Marshall proposed a program of massive economic assistance, the Marshall Plan.
Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist.
European reaction to Marshall's speech was quick and positive. The British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin hailed it as a lifeline to sinking men. Of all the nations invited to help draft the plan, only the Soviet Union and its satellites refused. The price would be high, up to $17 billion. But compared to the alternative, Marshall told Congress it was a bargain.
This program should be viewed as an investment in peace. In those terms, the cost is low.
While Congress debated the enormous financial commitment, communist-inspired riots led to the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Czechoslovakia. The events galvanized opinion on Capitol Hill, and Congress approved funding for the Marshall Plan. American aid was soon on its way to Europe. Food was distributed, machinery and technical support spurred new production. Homes and businesses were rebuilt. Marshall Plan aid provided nets for Flemish fishermen, money to rebuild Italian automotive factories, construction equipment for France, and coal to fuel Danish industry. The Marshall Plan was an overwhelming success. It launched Western Europe on the road to recovery, beat back the threat of communism in the region, and established the United States as the world's dominant economic superpower. It also contributed to the first major confrontation of the Cold War. At the Potsdam Conference in 1945, the Allies had agreed to temporarily divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, administered by the U.S., Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. The German capital of Berlin, which lay deep within the Soviet zone, was partitioned in the same way. But 3 years later, Germany remained divided, and Berlin had become a microcosm of the Cold War struggle for all of Europe. The Soviet foreign minister emphasized the importance of the German capital. What happens to Berlin happens to Germany. What happens to Germany happens to Europe. The Soviets had plundered the eastern zone of Germany, hauling off machinery, equipment, train tracks, even entire factories to rebuild the Soviet Union. At the same time, the zones under Western control were beginning to thrive. To aid in the recovery, a new currency was introduced, the Deutschmark. Stalin condemned the move as American economic imperialism and retaliated. On June 24, 1948, he ordered all land access into the city of West Berlin to be sealed off, beginning the Berlin blockade. Roads and railways were shut down. Shipments of goods languished at border crossings. Power to the city was turned off. Stalin was determined to force the Western Allies out of West Berlin and starve its people into submission. The German capital symbolized American commitment to Europe, but was saving West Berlin worth the risk of war with the Soviets? There would be no debate. President Truman declared, "We are going to stay, period." Within days, the United States and Great Britain orchestrated the Berlin Airlift to resupply the beleaguered city. Day and night, planes ferried in food, coal, and medical supplies. On average, a flight landed in West Berlin every 3 minutes. More than 2 million tons of cargo were delivered to Berlin during the 15-month operation. Each mission brought the threat of Soviet military intervention, but it never came, and the flights continued unchallenged. Finally, in May 1949, the Soviets relented and lifted the blockade. In its wake, any hopes to reunify the country were abandoned, and a permanently divided Germany became a reality. Democratic West Germany and Communist East Germany. The blockade underscored the need for a united defense against Soviet aggression. In 1949, the United States and Canada joined with 10 European nations to form a military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. A rebuilt, rearmed West Germany would join the alliance in 1955. In response, the Soviet Union and its satellites formed a competing alliance, the Warsaw Pact. Through 1948, the success of the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the Berlin Airlift had frustrated Soviet plans to dominate Europe. But the Red Star was rising, and 1949 would be an explosive year for world communism. In August, the Soviets stunned the world when they successfully tested their own atomic bomb, years ahead of expert predictions. And in China, communist revolutionary Mao Zedong prevailed in a decades-long civil war against the Chinese nationalist government. Nearly 500 million Chinese fell under communist rule. For decades to come, Mao would be the linchpin of revolution in Asia, supporting fledgling governments in Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Malaya, and in Korea, where the Cold War superpowers drew perilously close to World War III. Through the early years of the Cold War, the Truman administration's policy of containment had halted Soviet expansion in Europe. Their attempts to halt the spread of communism elsewhere were much less successful. The end of World War II brought renewed violence in a long-running Chinese Civil War. In 1949, Communist leader Mao Zedong launched an all-out offensive to defeat Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. American efforts to mediate an end to the conflict failed, and Chiang's government was forced to flee into exile. At home, conservatives blamed President Truman's administration for what they called the loss of China to communism. News that the Soviets had successfully tested their first atomic bomb and a series of sensational spy cases convinced many that the enemy had seized the initiative in the Cold War. In June 1950, these fears seemed to be confirmed when the Communist Army of North Korea launched a blistering attack against its neighbor, South Korea. Within days, they had overrun the capital of Seoul and forced the defending South Korean army into full retreat. The North Korean invasion was the first military challenge of the Cold War. How the United States responded to the threat was critically important. Following World War II, Korea was temporarily divided at the 38th parallel and jointly occupied by the United States in the south and the Soviet Union in the north. The Soviets turned North Korea into a communist state. They installed into power a dictator named Kim Il-sung. In South Korea, the United States established a pro-Western government under Syngman Rhee, an oppressive yet fanatically anti-communist leader. Both Rhee and Kim aspired to unite Korea under their own rule, but neither the U.S. nor the Soviet Union would allow their client states to start a war. That changed in 1950. Kim finally convinced Joseph Stalin to support his invasion of South Korea. Kim would provide the troops, Stalin would supply the military hardware, and Mao Zedong, if it became necessary, would provide Chinese reinforcements. Kim promised that victory would be swift and decisive. But it would be neither. Half a world away, the North Korean invasion sparked intense debate in Washington. Was the assault ordered by the Soviets? Was this the beginning of World War III? President Truman and his advisors quickly decided to take action.
An act of aggression such as this creates a very real danger to the security of all free nations. This challenge has been presented squarely. We must meet it squarely.
The U.S. acted through the United Nations. Their mandate was explicit: repel the attack and restore peace to the area. A coalition of 15 countries agreed to send troops. But the overwhelming majority of fighting men were American, fighting under General Douglas MacArthur to defend American interests in the region. In diplomatic language, it was termed a police action, but it was a war. In the words of military historian Slam Marshall, the century's nastiest little war. General MacArthur rushed his troops to the battlefront. But the ill-prepared units were completely overwhelmed by the disciplined North Korean army, fighting with Soviet tanks and artillery. Within a month, MacArthur's army had retreated to the tip of the Korean peninsula, near Pusan, while plans were laid for a daring amphibious landing behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. If it were successful, the North Korean army could be trapped. If it failed, UN forces might be wiped out entirely. The assault at Incheon came on September 15, 1950. It was a gauntlet dangerous currents, extraordinary tides, defense fortifications, and massive seawalls. One planner described the obstacles. We drew up a list of every natural and geographic handicap, and Inchon had all of them. Despite the challenges, the invasion was a stunning success. Within days, the capital city of Seoul was liberated. With the restoration of South Korea, the UN mission had been accomplished. But General MacArthur demanded the authority to cross the 38th parallel into North Korea. The political risks were immense. Would the Soviets retaliate? Would Communist China intervene? There were rumors that Mao's troops were already massing along the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. President Truman reluctantly agreed to MacArthur's appeal, but he warned his general, stay away from the Chinese border. Mr. President, MacArthur replied, if the Chinese cross the Yalu, I will make of them the greatest slaughter in the history of warfare. In early October 1950, the first American troops marched north, across the 38th parallel, toward China. By the end of October, MacArthur's forces had captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. By Thanksgiving Day, they approached the Yalu River. As the general prepared for the final offensive, he cabled President Truman. This should, for all practical purposes, end the war. But MacArthur had underestimated the enemy. On the night of November 25th, the Chinese army struck with fury.
At the White House in Washington, top defense officials of the nation gather to discuss the gravest world crisis since Poland and Pearl Harbor. The flagrant aggression of Chinese communist troops in Korea arouses the country's ire. With the North Korean bandits well under control and with the promise that UN troops would be withdrawn, the unexpected entry of 300,000 Red Chinese across the Manchurian border may well precipitate World War III. President Truman voices his accusation of Red imperialism.
The forces of the United Nations are in Korea to put down an aggression that threatens not only the whole fabric of the United Nations, but all human hopes of peace and justice. If the United Nations yields to the forces of aggression, no nation will be safe or secure. If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival. We have committed ourselves to the cause of a just and peaceful world order through the United Nations. We stand by that commitment.
On the battlefront in Korea, United Nations forces fight desperately to meet the Red attack. Here our troops must face what General MacArthur has termed a new war. Outnumbered more than 2-to-1 by Chinese and North Koreans, the UN forces hope to regroup and to meet the overwhelming attack which has broken their fluid lines of defense across northern Korea.
UN forces fought desperately to escape the Chinese onslaught. At the Chosin Reservoir, 6,000 Marines were encircled by the enemy. With temperatures dipping to minus 40 degrees below zero, their situation seemed hopeless. But in a heroic effort, dubbed the Chosin Breakout, their big guns and air support smashed the Chinese lines. 60,000 enemy troops were killed, and the Marines escaped. General MacArthur demanded that he be allowed to wage an all-out war against China. But President Truman was determined that Korea should remain a limited war. When MacArthur made it clear that he disagreed with that policy, the president fired him. By the spring of 1951, the war had degenerated into a brutal stalemate near the 38th parallel. American troops continued to fight and die in Korea for 2 long years. In the end, more than 4 million soldiers and civilians were killed during the conflict. Among them, 40,000 Americans died. For Harry Truman, the costly war in Korea was a crushing blow to his presidency. His popularity, already weakened by charges of losing China, collapsed. When the ceasefire agreement was finally signed in July 1953, it was Truman's successor, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who earned the credit.
We have won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world. We and our United Nation allies must be vigilant against the possibility of untoward developments.
Korea is often called the Forgotten War, but it dramatically changed America's sense of security. For many, it reinforced the belief in monolithic communism, the assumption that all communist movements were orchestrated from Moscow. The idea poisoned American politics for decades and set the stage for the disaster in Vietnam. Korea also put the country on a permanent war footing, leading to spiraling defense spending and greatly increasing the Pentagon's influence. By the end of his term in 1960, President Eisenhower warned of a growing threat to the nation from within.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Attention, attention. This is an official civil defense warning. This is not a test. The United States is under nuclear attack. Take cover immediately in your carrier fallout shelter. Repeat, the United States is under nuclear attack.
America's Cold War years were filled with fear. Daily radio and newspaper reports blared frightening stories of advancing communism, imminent nuclear war, and Soviet spies. America responded with an all-out offensive against communist infiltration.
The growing menace of communism arouses the House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee. Among the well-informed witnesses testifying is J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Hoover speaks with authority on the subject.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
While Hoover's FBI worked behind the scenes, Congress expanded its own high-profile investigations, often ignoring the civil rights of the accused.
Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
Oh, well, you would.
Yes.
Beginning in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, investigated communist influence in Hollywood. The committee was concerned with the power of movies to persuade audiences with subversive messages. With movie stars and other industry professionals called to testify, the hearings became red carpet events. For the anti-communist witch hunt, it was a publicity bonanza.
It is completely against the un-American feeling, this communistic thing. I believe I would move to the state of Texas if it ever came here, because I think the Texans would kill them on sight.
We have sold them some films. A good many years ago, they bought the Three Little Pigs and used it through Russia.
If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
Most witnesses cooperated with the committee. However, a small group who became known as the Hollywood 10 refused to answer questions, citing protection under the First Amendment. Among them, screenwriter John Howard Lawson.
The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I am framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
then
answer
you denied,
to a question
then
which
you,
invades his, absolutely invades
then
his
you
right.
denied, you refused to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and everything else to the American public, and they will know where I stand, as they do from what I have written.
Stand away from the stand.
I have written for Americanism for many years, and I shall
stand away from the stand.
For the Bill of Rights,
stand away from the stand. Therefore, it is the unanimous opinion of this subcommittee John Howard Lawson is in contempt of Congress.
The Hollywood 10 were convicted of contempt and sent to prison. Thousands of others were blacklisted by the studios, forcing many talented movie makers into exile and obscurity. Among the friendly witnesses who testified in 1947 was a B-movie actor named Ronald Reagan. No one could have suspected that 4 decades later, Reagan would play a leading role in bringing the Cold War to an end.
If communists have attempted to inject their propaganda into the motion picture, they have failed miserably.
Perhaps Hollywood wasn't influenced by communists, but it was affected by the hearings. Movie studios added to the hysteria by cranking out such anti-communist films as Is This Tomorrow?, Red Planet Mars, and dozens of others. But tawdry films did little to distract President Truman from what he saw as a perversion of American democracy.
Now I'm going to tell you how we're not going to fight communism. We're not going to transform our fine FBI into a Gestapo secret police. We're not going to try to control what our people read and say and think. We're not going to turn the United States into a right-wing totalitarian country in order to deal with a left-wing totalitarian threat. In short, we're not going to end democracy. We're going to keep the Bill of Rights on the books.
Against the president's objections, Congress passed more dubious legislation, including the Internal Security Bill of 1950, which empowered the government to take action against anyone it deemed a security risk. Truman called it the greatest danger to freedom of speech, press, and assembly since the Alien and Sedition laws of 1798. In 1948, the Red Hunt struck at the very center of government when ex-communist Whittaker Chambers accused a former State Department employee named Alger Hiss of spying for the Soviet Union.
I first knew him as Crosley. What his name is today, I am not prepared to testify to, or what other names he may have had.
Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting, and I am fighting.
The House committee was prepared to dismiss the case for lack of conclusive evidence, but one of its members pressed the issue, an ambitious young congressman from California, Richard Nixon.
These documents were fed out of the State Department over 10 years ago by communists who were employees of that department and who were interested in seeing that these documents were sent to the Soviet Union, where the interests of the Soviet Union happened to be in conflict with those of the United States.
Alger Hiss was convicted, not of treason, but of perjury, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His supporters said he was a victim of the communist hysteria. Others saw him as part of a communist conspiracy to destroy the United States and press the search for more traitors. Within months, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested in connection with a plot to pass U.S. bomb secrets to the Soviets. The Rosenbergs denied the charges and claimed they were being persecuted as Jews and for their left-wing views. The evidence suggested they played a small but material role in the spy ring. The Rosenbergs were convicted and sentenced to die in the electric chair. Protests erupted amid claims of anti-Semitism. The Nobel Prize-winning writer Jean-Paul Sartre condemned the sentence as a legal lynching which smears with blood a whole nation. He warned,
"Your country is sick with fear. You are afraid of the shadow of your own bomb."
Despite the outcry, the Rosenbergs were executed in 1953.
Union Square in New York was the backdrop for these scenes of red violence. From their ranks will come the saboteurs, spies, and subversives, should World War III be forced upon America.
At the height of the anti-communist hysteria, the real danger to America came not from the Reds, but from the so-called Red Baiters.
Even if there were only one communist in the State Department, even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
Of all the demagogues who exploited the Red Scare for political gain, no one matched the senator from Wisconsin, whose namesake, McCarthyism, would come to define the entire era of political persecution. Senator Joseph McCarthy emerged from virtual obscurity in 1950 when he claimed he had a list of 205 communists working in the State Department. The claim was patently untrue, but it launched McCarthy on a political juggernaut. For 4 years, the senator ran roughshod over civil liberties, while the news media served as a conduit for his reckless, unsubstantiated charges.
He had been a member of the party that he had recommended.
McCarthy's audacity knew no bounds. He accused Secretary of State George Marshall, the architect of the Marshall Plan, of infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. He threatened President Truman and suggested the Democratic Party was a bedfellow of international communism. The hysteria of McCarthyism seeped into every aspect of American life. People rushed to condemn friends, neighbors, and co-workers. Many were fired or shunned for perceived left leanings. Though McCarthy wore a cloak of patriotism, his abusive actions had a chilling effect on democracy. He was told,
"You have created an atmosphere so vile that people have lost confidence in their government."
But slowly, the tide began to turn. Dissenters spoke out.
McCarthy to wear a new case of known red in Army.
The respected journalist Edward R. Murrow attacked McCarthy's repugnant tactics on his investigative TV series, See It Now.
1 month ago tonight, we presented a report on Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. We labeled it as controversial.
McCarthy remained characteristically defiant.
If I am giving comfort to our enemies, I ought not to be in the Senate. If, on the other hand, Mr. Murrow is giving comfort to our enemies, he ought not to be brought into the homes of millions of Americans by the Columbia Broadcasting System.
With his support withering, McCarthy pitted himself against the U.S. Army in an investigation of charges and countercharges concerning clout, favoritism, and communist cover-ups.
Unless we make sure that there is no infiltration of our government, then just as certain as you sit there, you will see a red world.
The ensuing Army McCarthy hearings tore away the senator's mask of self-righteousness and struck a fatal blow to his crusade.
Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness.
The hearings were a media circus, and in the end, inconclusive. But for the tens of millions of viewers who tuned in to watch, McCarthy was revealed to be an arrogant, blustering tyrant.
The American people have had a look at you for 6 weeks. You're not fooling anyone either.
The American public had seen enough. Nearly overnight, McCarthy's immense national popularity evaporated. President Eisenhower probably spoke for millions of Americans when he said,
"It's no longer McCarthyism, it's McCarthyism."
3 years later, Joseph McCarthy died, probably of complications from alcoholism. He was 48 years old. McCarthy faded, but an unsettling question remained. Could America win the Cold War without sacrificing the very liberties it was fighting to safeguard? Ominously, a highly classified government report concluded, "It is now clear we are facing an implacable enemy whose avowed objective is world domination. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct do not apply." A new and frightening day was dawning, one in which legal and moral restraints were set aside in a high-stakes game of diplomatic maneuvering, clandestine operations, and nuclear brinksmanship. Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin led their nations from World War victory in 1945 through 7 years of tense confrontation. By 1953, it was time for a new generation of cold warriors to take command. In Washington, the changing of the guard came democratically.
The people speak, and their verdict, a landslide victory for Dwight D. Eisenhower, elected president with the greatest popular vote ever given a White House candidate.
The hero of D-Day, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, became the first Republican president in 20 years. On the campaign trail, Eisenhower pledged to take a hard line with the Soviet Union and to bring an end to the war in Korea.
You have summoned me on behalf of millions of your fellow Americans to lead a great crusade for freedom in America and freedom in the world.
As president, Eisenhower continued the policy of containment, but his administration's new look defense strategy relied more heavily on air power and nuclear weapons. Deploying an effective nuclear arsenal was easier and cheaper than maintaining a massive land army. Eisenhower could defend the nation, cut taxes, and curb inflation, all at the same time. In the expression of the day, it was a bigger bang for the buck. The new look was not just economical, it was aggressive. The White House adopted a policy of massive retaliation to deter Soviet aggression. It stated that if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe, the U.S. would respond by launching more than 3,000 nuclear missiles against every major urban, industrial, and military target throughout the communist world. Experts estimated that such an attack would kill 285 million people. President Eisenhower refused to consider options that stopped short of total war. But even as the Eisenhower White House was refining its Cold War strategy, news from Moscow that Joseph Stalin had died dramatically altered the playing field. The official cause was a stroke, but many suspected poison. Without a plan for succession, a collective leadership assumed control of the Soviet Union. Almost immediately, they extended an olive branch to the west. Speaking for the party, Georgy Malenkov declared, "We stand as we have always stood for peaceful coexistence of the two systems." Coming from the avowed enemy of capitalism, peaceful coexistence was a radical notion. Was this just Soviet propaganda, or was the new Kremlin really different than the old? In an address dubbed Chance for Peace, Eisenhower called on the Soviets to demonstrate they had truly broken with Stalin's legacy.
I know of only one question upon which progress waits. It is this: what is the Soviet Union ready to do? Whatever the answer is, let it be plainly spoken. Again we say the hunger for peace is too great, the hour in history too late for any government to mock men's hopes with mere words and promises and gestures.
Before the Soviets could respond, the president's seemingly genuine offer was contradicted by his own Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. He ridiculed the idea of peaceful coexistence as a ploy to divide the Western Allies, adding, "We are not dancing to any Russian tune." The chance for peace, if it ever existed, was squandered, and U.S.-Soviet relations continued to vacillate between measured tolerance and outright disdain. 2 years later, in 1955, both nations were seeking opportunities to relax Cold War tensions. They met face-to-face in Geneva, Switzerland, for the first time since the end of World War II.
Some 11 years ago, I came to Europe with an army, a navy, an air force, with a single purpose, to destroy Nazism. This time, I come armed with something far more powerful, the goodwill of America, the great hopes of America, the aspirations of America for peace.
Americans got their first good look at the new Kremlin powers at the summit. There was Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin, Defense Minister Marshal Zhukov, and the outspoken head of the Soviet Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev. During discussions, Eisenhower suggested a program he called Open Skies that would permit air reconnaissance over both countries. Bulganin and Zhukov were receptive to the idea, but Khrushchev quickly denounced the idea as a bold espionage plot. After 2 years of uncertainty, it was clear that Nikita Khrushchev was now the top man in Moscow. Khrushchev's reason for refusing Open Skies was simple. His nation had been threatening the West with nuclear rockets it simply did not have, and bombs it could not deliver onto American soil. These military shortcomings were a closely held secret in the Kremlin, but they would not remain secret for long. On July 4th, 1957, a Lockheed U-2 spy plane made its inaugural flight over the Soviet Union. From an altitude of 70,000 feet, the U-2 captured stunningly clear images of its target. For 4 years, U-2 flights gathered revealing intelligence about Soviet military installations and missile deployments. But President Eisenhower feared the inevitable. Sooner or later, he said, one of these things is going to get shot down. Nikita Khrushchev was an entirely new kind of Soviet leader. He was not evil like Joseph Stalin, but in his relations with the West, he was openly defiant and often belligerent. He boasted of the Soviet Union's vastly superior nuclear capabilities that could wipe out any American or European city. True or not, Khrushchev's threats to unleash his rocket weapons on Western targets was unnerving. But for all his nuclear posturing, Khrushchev could be amiable and at times even likable. In 1959, he engaged Vice President Richard Nixon in an impromptu debate over the relative merits of capitalism and communism.
Teach us some things, and it will teach you some things too. Because after all, you don't know everything.
That every word that you have said here will be reported in the United States, and they will see you say it on television.
Khrushchev would soon have a chance to witness a capitalist democracy firsthand.
The President of the United States has invited Mr. Nikita Khrushchev, Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, to pay an official visit to the United States in September.
Khrushchev was the first Soviet head of state ever to visit the United States. During his stay, he was exposed to the extremes of American life and culture, from movie stars in Hollywood to farm production in the American heartland.
Nikita Khrushchev's American tour swings into the world's best corn country. At one of the world's most modern, efficient, and profitable farming operations, Khrushchev shows an enthusiasm springing from his Ukrainian peasant background and the interest of a leader whose nation has long known major food production problems.
The Soviet leader acknowledged the riches of the United States, but boasted, "Tomorrow we shall be as rich as you are." The next day, even richer. Meetings with President Eisenhower failed to break new ground, but the two leaders bridged a divide. They pledged to meet again in Paris the following year. Khrushchev was deeply moved by his American experience.
Хорошим американским словом. Окей? Хорошо. До свидания, друзья. I hope that in the relationships between our two countries, we will be able to use more and more often the good short American word, okay, until we meet again, friends.
Upon returning to Moscow, he openly declared, "Long live Soviet-American friendship," pledging his nation to massive cuts in its conventional military as a first step towards peace. By this time, the U-2 had revealed that the Soviets were greatly exaggerating their nuclear capabilities. Seeing continued surveillance as a diplomatic risk, Eisenhower had suspended the flights. But under pressure from his advisors, he reluctantly agreed to allow one more mission.
May Day in Moscow. This year's parade through Red Square is a 3.5-hour affair with emphasis on peaceful coexistence.
On May 1st, 1960, as Kremlin leaders waved to the May Day crowds in Red Square, a U-2, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over Soviet airspace. In an instant, the plane, the pilot, and any chance for peaceful coexistence came crashing to Earth. The White House had devised a cover plan for just such an occurrence. They claimed the U-2 was on a weather mission originating in Turkey for NASA and had strayed off course. The next day, they changed the story. The plane was piloted by a civilian, and a failure in oxygen equipment had resulted in the pilot losing consciousness and accidentally violating Soviet airspace. It was all rubbish. Khrushchev knew the U.S. had been flying spy missions over the Soviet Union, and now he had the evidence to prove it. The wreckage of the U-2 and the American pilot, alive and kicking. Trapped, Eisenhower finally came clean with the American public.
Now, this does not put the United States on trial whatsoever.
At the Paris summit 2 weeks later, Khrushchev turned the U-2 incident into a crisis.
Khrushchev outdoes his earlier outburst against President Eisenhower at the commencement of the Paris meeting. Flanked by Foreign Minister Gromyko and glowering Marshal Malinowski, he fires a barrage of threats, insults, and menaces, warns of devastating blows at bases used by American espionage planes, denounces American acts of aggression, and in general follows a tough line that seems to signal a new freezing spell in the Cold War.
The captured U-2 pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was convicted of espionage against the Soviet Union and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was August 17, 1960. That very same day, in the skies over the Pacific Ocean, an Air Force pilot snatched a falling capsule from midair. The event marked a breakthrough in the top-secret project to develop Corona, the world's first Earth-orbiting reconnaissance satellite. The U-2 may have been downed, but America had a new eye in the sky, and this one could capture stunningly clear and revealing images of its target from more than 100 miles in outer space. Joseph Stalin made the dark cloud hanging over the Cold War infinitely more sinister. His crimes against his own people were so great as to be immeasurable. 1 million, 10 million, perhaps 40 million Soviet citizens perished during his reign of terror. His was a government run by fear, cruelty, and finally, madness. But in March 1953, the monster met his end, and leadership of the Soviet Union passed to a collective of top Kremlin officials. They sought to distance themselves from Stalin's cruel legacy, but they soon realized that fear and intimidation were the only things keeping them in power. The first test of their authority came almost instantly. In East Germany, Walter Ulbricht ran his government according to the cold-blooded dictates of Stalinism. No one dared challenge his authority for fear of imprisonment or death. Stalin himself boasted that a revolt by the East German people was impossible. Revolt? Why, they won't even cross the street unless the light is green. But in June 1953, they stormed the streets in waves of anti-government protest. The violence quickly spread to cities across East Germany. With Ulbricht's government in peril, Moscow ordered Soviet forces to intervene and put an end to the demonstrations. Hundreds were killed or later executed. The events of the 1953 East German uprising are recounted in a poem by the German poet Bertolt Brecht. After the uprising of the 17 June, the secretary of the Writers' Union had leaflets distributed in the Stallone, stating that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could win it back only by redoubled efforts. Would it not be easier, in that case, for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? In the United States, the new administration had not anticipated the challenge to Soviet authority. Despite his campaign pledge to roll back communism and free the enslaved people of Eastern Europe, President Eisenhower refused to intervene. In the wake of the East German uprising, the top ranks of the Kremlin were reshuffled. When the bloodletting was over, a single man stood at the pinnacle of Soviet government: Nikita Khrushchev. With power consolidated in the Kremlin, the Soviet Union and the Cold War took a dramatic turn. In 1956, Khrushchev rocked the communist world to its core by tearing down the legacy of Stalin himself. Before the 20th Communist Party Congress, he unleashed a fiery 4-hour condemnation of the late Soviet leader and his cult of personality. Stalin abandoned the method of ideological struggle for that of administrative violence, mass repressions, and terror. He possessed a capricious and despotic character, and he was a supreme egotist and sadist, capable of sacrificing anything and anybody for his own power and glory. The impact of the secret speech was immense. It ushered in a period of relative liberalization known as Khrushchev's thaw. By Western standards, the changes were modest. But to the long-suffering people of Eastern Europe, enraged by 10 years of Soviet-style repression, they were cause for revolution. Just months after the secret speech, an uprising by Polish workers challenged Khrushchev to make good on his promises for reform. In its aftermath, Vice President Richard Nixon noted cynically, it would serve American interests if the Soviets pounded another upstart satellite, such as Hungary, into submission. He got his wish in October of 1956. In the Hungarian capital of Budapest, students and workers demonstrated against the repressive policies of the country's Stalinist government. They demanded an end to the Soviet military occupation, free elections, and the return to power of their deposed prime minister, Imre Nagy. But events quickly spiraled out of control. The Hungarian secret police opened fire on a crowd of demonstrators. But that only fueled the rioting. Symbols of Soviet enslavement were destroyed. Hungarian resistance fighters, or partisans, hunted down and killed government officials. By the next day, Soviet forces had entered the fray, and the city was at war. The partisans fought Soviet tanks using Molotov cocktails and small arms. The American-sponsored Radio Free Europe encouraged the rebels to fight the Soviets to the death. Finally, after nearly a week of violence, an uneasy ceasefire descended on the city. Soviet tanks were withdrawn. Negotiations were commenced to seat a new government in Budapest, independent of Moscow's influence. Against impossible odds, it appeared the heroic freedom fighters had prevailed against the mighty Soviet Union.
At the end of a 6-day fight that astonished the world and shook the Kremlin to its foundations, Hungary was free to fraternize on its own borders, and rush in supplies to the stricken city of Budapest along roads littered with burnt-out red tanks, disabled by almost unarmed men fired by passion for liberty. Flaring swiftly from student demonstrations into open revolution, the pent-up hatreds of oppression sent Russian might reeling and forced withdrawal of the red yoke. But even as these scenes were recorded, rumors flared of the re-entry of Russian forces and new fighting. The beautiful city of Budapest, scarred by conflict, again faces a Russian onslaught, even before the debris of the fight for freedom is cleared from the streets.
The world watched and waited, even as tens of thousands of desperate refugees fled for their lives. Khrushchev agonized over what to do next. Could he allow Hungary to determine its own political future? That would mean losing face and perhaps losing the rest of Eastern Europe. In the end, it was too much to concede. On November 4th, Soviet military forces rolled into Hungary with orders to terminate the rebellion. A radio transmission captured the final desperate moments of Hungarian freedom.
We are under heavy machine gun fire. We will hold out till the last drop of blood. Goodbye, friends. God save our souls. The Russians are too near.
In America, the man who promised to roll back communism provided no military support. No diplomatic intervention. Nothing. Budapest lay in ruins. Several thousand were dead. Thousands more were wounded. Imre Nagy was arrested by Soviet forces, imprisoned, and executed. Khrushchev said it would serve as a lesson to all other leaders in socialist countries.
Suez Canal, storm center of controversy for weeks, now becomes a cause of war in a lightning sequence of diplomatic and military moves. Since its seizure and nationalization by President Nasser of Egypt, the vital waterway has precipitated a new crisis in the already tense Middle East. Crack French units are embarked at Marseille, bound for a joint staging area with Great Britain on Cyprus.
In 1956, the Soviet Union wasn't the only country fighting to hold on to its satellites. While Russian tanks were crushing the Hungarian uprising, Britain and France invaded Egypt in a display of colonial arrogance and brutal desperation. Their attack was aimed at regaining control of the Suez Canal, the strategic link between the oil-rich Middle East and Western Europe, which had been controlled by an Anglo-French alliance for nearly a century. The incursion ended in humiliation for the invaders. It was a sign of the times for the once great colonial empires. During the decades following World War II, dozens of colonies defied colonial rule by declaring their independence. Each had to choose a method of government, and most faced severe economic challenges. Many new nations were forced to choose sides in the Cold War, leading to internal divisions, authoritarian governments, and anarchy. But a coalition of poor African and Asian states sought to avoid this fate. They banded together to gain more influence in global affairs. When leaders of the non-aligned movement met in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955, they represented 2/3 of the world's population.
It is a new departure in the history of the world that leaders of Asian and African peoples can meet together in their own countries to discuss and deliberate upon matters of common concern.
Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, represented the rising tide of Arab nationalism in the Middle East. He described his form of government as moderate socialism, explaining it as socialism without capitalists, without imperialists, and without communists. But Nasser and other shrewd leaders played the two superpowers against each other to gain military and economic aid. American leaders suspected that many non-allied nations were under communist influence and tried to change their governments. In 1953, the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, became the target of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency's first regime change action. The CIA engineered a coup to get rid of Mossadegh, and then vested power in the Shah of Iran. The Shah became a staunch ally of the West. By the time U.S. President Richard Nixon visited Iran in 1972, most Iranians resented the Shah's repressive government and America's growing influence in the Middle East. But the success of the Iranian coup had been intoxicating and gave rise to many similar operations designed to eliminate potential threats and shape the politics of the Third World. They did not all meet with success, but none failed as catastrophically as American attempts at nation-building in Vietnam. Vietnam and its neighbors in Southeast Asia were colonized by the French in the 19th century. French Indochina, as it was known, was the crown jewel in France's vast empire until the beginning of World War II, when Japan invaded the region and seized control of Vietnam. When the war ended in 1945, France sought to reclaim its colony. They were opposed by a communist organization called the Viet Minh. Their leader was a Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh. Ho dreamed of uniting his country under one independent government. France fought the Vietnam for 8 years in the First Indochina War before suffering a devastating defeat in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. French forces withdrew from Vietnam, while Ho's popularity spread throughout the country. But Vietnam became a pawn in the emerging Cold War. During ceasefire negotiations, the country was divided. Ho and his communist government would rule North Vietnam. A new Western-backed government was created in the South. American leaders feared that all of Vietnam would turn communist. They pushed aside the French and supported South Vietnamese Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem. Vietnam itself was not strategically important to the U.S., but American leaders feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in the region would follow. This became known as the domino principle.
Finally, you have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up and you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is certainly it'll go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influence.
The tragedy that followed was epic in its scope and senselessness. Billions of dollars and more than 50,000 American lives were spent to stop the dominoes from falling. In the process, the United States laid waste to much of the country and killed more than 3 million people. But the justification for war in Vietnam was fatally flawed. Ho was a communist, but he was not a puppet of Moscow, as the U.S. feared. His resistance was based on a fierce patriotism that inspired his people to fight on, even in the face of almost inconceivable losses. With the benefit of military support from the Soviet Union and Communist China, they frustrated the U.S. for 2 decades. Finally, in 1975, a tired and demoralized United States abandoned the war. The last Americans were evacuated from South Vietnam, and communist forces overran the capital city of Saigon.
But these events, tragic as they are, portend neither the end of the world nor of America's leadership in the world.
In the end, the dominoes didn't fall. But the communist victory did influence the Cold War. In the 1970s, the United States endured a crisis of self-confidence that came to be known as the Vietnam Syndrome. Americans lost faith in their government. Political leaders lost faith in their military. The country questioned its role in foreign affairs. No one had any taste for another Vietnam. This view contributed to an easing of international relations during the decade known as détente. In the Soviet Union, the effects of the Vietnam War were even more far-reaching. Emboldened by the communist victory and America's ambivalence toward foreign affairs, Kremlin leaders spent lavishly to build their arsenals and extend their communist empire around the world. It was, in effect, a brazen attempt to overtake the United States and win the Cold War. It would be, however, their greatest mistake.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
As John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency in 1961, he inherited an all-or-nothing defense policy. It provided only two military options for dealing with a Soviet threat: do nothing and let the diplomats work it out, or launch an all-out nuclear attack against the communist bloc. Humiliation or Holocaust? President Kennedy demanded more options, a middle ground. A new defense policy emerged known as flexible response. It called for a massive buildup in conventional forces, as well as new tactical and strategic nuclear arms. It also emphasized counterinsurgency and other unconventional military operations for dealing with threats in the Third World. With this diverse arsenal, the president and his advisors believed it would be possible to fight a limited war with the Soviets, even a limited nuclear war, without igniting a world-ending apocalypse. This premise was tested by the major Cold War crises of the early 1960s. Kennedy encountered his first international challenge after just 3 months in office. Just 90 miles from the beaches of Florida, a military dictator had seized power in Cuba. Fidel Castro promised his people,
not communism or Marxism, but representative democracy, social justice, and a well-planned economy.
But U.S. leaders feared the worst. Castro looked like a communist and talked like a communist. He was a liability. In April 1961, plans were set in motion for an armed invasion of Cuba. The covert mission took its name from the main landing ground on the Bay of Pigs. The CIA had armed and trained a band of Cuban exiles for the covert operation. President Kennedy approved the plan, but then he crippled the operation by refusing air and naval support. The invasion force was crushed. The Kennedy administration humiliated. Attorney General Robert Kennedy feared that the Soviet Union would seize on the Bay of Pigs as a sign of weakness. He warned his brother, "If we don't want Russia to set up missile bases in Cuba, we had better decide now what we are willing to do to stop it." Following the Bay of Pigs, the U.S. imposed economic sanctions on Cuba. Castro appealed to the Soviet Union for aid. For Khrushchev, it was a coup, a communist outpost in America's own backyard. What could be better? Khrushchev's elation sprouted into a germ of an idea. What if we threw a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants? While Khrushchev's scheme took root in the Caribbean, the two Cold War superpowers faced off over the increasingly contentious issue of Berlin. By the 1960s, West Berlin was a thriving cosmopolitan city. In the words of one Cold War historian, the West German capital was a permanent advertisement for the virtues of capitalism and democracy in the middle of communist East Germany. Still, West Berliners lived with the fear that the communists could cut off land access to their city, as they had done during the Berlin blockade in 1948. Jobs, prosperity, and freedom, and the security afforded by the American military presence beckoned to the hungry, disenfranchised, and repressed of East Germany. To the exasperation of their communist leaders, millions fled across the open border. By the time President Kennedy met Nikita Khrushchev in 1961, millions of East Germany's best and brightest had left the country, and the mass exodus had become a crisis for the communists.
Marxism was born in Germany. If it does not prove itself as superior and vital here, then we have not won.
Tired of haggling over the divided city, Khrushchev issued an ultimatum to the American president: withdraw U.S. troops currently occupying West Berlin, or face a blockade. Kennedy stood his ground.
We will at all times be ready to talk, if talk will help. But we must also be ready to resist with force, if force is used upon us. The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin.
War did not come to Berlin, but a wall did. Barbed wire and concrete 12 feet high and 100 miles long, isolating West Berlin. East German border patrols had orders to shoot to kill, and they did. The wall was a hateful thing, Khrushchev admitted, but what should I have done? The East German economy would have collapsed. The much-hated Berlin Wall finally settled the nagging German question and averted war in Europe. But events elsewhere threatened to push the world to the brink of destruction. In the summer of 1962, Khrushchev's hedgehog triggered the gravest confrontation of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet ships crossed the Atlantic bound for Cuba. They carried military hardware, Soviet troops, and nuclear missiles capable of striking nearly anywhere in the United States. On October 14th, U-2 reconnaissance flights over Cuba confirmed what for months had been rumored.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons be turned back.
For Americans, the idea of going to war with the Soviet Union was terrifying, but having nuclear missiles stationed permanently in Cuba was unthinkable.
I'd hate like heck to see us go to war, but if it's necessary to prevent a nuclear war, I think the action has to be taken at this time.
Well, I think it's high time we stopped Russia from having things her own way.
I know that some action should be taken, but he's going to have to tread very lightly, short of war.
At the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted his Soviet counterpart.
All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation. Yes or no?
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
The crisis turned critical. U.S. military forces prepared for a possible invasion of Cuba. It was the greatest emergency troop mobilization since World War II. For the first time in its history, the nation's nuclear army, the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, moved to Defense Condition 2. The next step, DEFCON 1, would mean nuclear war. If a nuclear strike was launched from Cuba, American Minuteman missiles were poised to destroy every major city in the Soviet Union.
Re-entry, arming and fusing.
Just as the flexible response had promised, the president had every military option at his disposal.
Warhead, arming and fusing. Channel 7.
As tension mounted, the first opening in the crisis came from Khrushchev. On October 26th, he cabled the president.
Mr. Kennedy, you and I are like two men pulling on a rope with a knot in the middle. The harder we pull, the tighter the knot, until even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it. Let us relax forces, take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this.
As the two leaders fumbled to untie the knot, events they had unleashed threatened to overwhelm them. Castro pleaded with Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike should the U.S. mount an invasion. In Washington, Kennedy was pressed to attack Cuba. Air Force General Curtis LeMay insisted American military forces should surround the island and, if need be, fry it. While the world edged closer to the nuclear abyss, Bobby Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador in Washington to seek a negotiated settlement. In the end, diplomacy prevailed. On October 28th, a message was broadcast from Moscow. Khrushchev had agreed to remove the missiles. The world breathed a sigh of relief.
The following is the text of President Kennedy's statement of noon. I welcome Chairman Khrushchev's statesmanlike decision to stop building bases in Cuba, dismantling offensive weapons, returning them to the Soviet Union under UN verification. This is an important and constructive contribution to peace.
In exchange for the removal of Cuban missiles, President Kennedy pledged that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. Privately, he also agreed to remove American missiles stationed in Turkey and targeting the Soviet Union. The missile crisis caused the president to reconsider his assumption that a nuclear war was winnable. He now understood that destroying the Soviet Union would mean sacrificing the United States to the same fate. This premise became the basis of a new Kennedy defense strategy: mutual assured destruction, MAD. The idea was that if no one stood a chance of surviving a nuclear war, no one would start one. Kennedy and Khrushchev tried to rein in the spiraling arms race following the Cuban Missile Crisis. Neither side was prepared to eliminate nuclear weapons, but during the 1960s, accords were reached on how to manage them. The first agreement was signed in 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. It was a small step, but laid the groundwork for a more productive relationship between the two leaders. It was not to be. 1 month after the Test Ban Treaty was signed in Moscow, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The official government investigation concluded that a lone gunman was responsible. Lee Harvey Oswald, an American communist with ties to the Soviet Union and Cuba. Was Oswald part of a conspiracy to assassinate the president? If he was, he took the secret to his grave. 2 days after the assassination, Oswald himself was gunned down. Just 4 months later, Khrushchev was deposed as head of the Soviet Union. The charges? He had allowed his own cult of personality to develop and no longer listened to advisors. He had ruined Soviet agriculture, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, and allowed the Berlin Wall to be constructed, a monument to the failures of communism. In short, Khrushchev's accusers said, he had humiliated the Soviet Union. Still, no blood was shed in this Russian Revolution. Khrushchev saw that as true progress.
Could anyone have dreamed of telling Stalin that he didn't suit us anymore and suggesting he retire? Not even a wet spot would have remained where we had been standing. Now, everything is different. The fear is gone. That's my contribution.
The end of the Kennedy-Khrushchev era ushered in a period of unprecedented social upheaval. both the United States and the Soviet Union were challenged by those within their own societies. America witnessed the struggle for civil rights and racial equality, political assassinations, and the youth counterculture of the 1960s. The Vietnam War divided American society. A growing credibility gap highlighted the contradictions between the statements of political leaders and the facts on the ground. By 1968, it seemed like the nation had come unraveled. That same year, the Soviet Union, now under Leonid Brezhnev, struggled to reassert its influence after the modest tolerance of the Khrushchev years. In Czechoslovakia, a communist reformer named Alexander Dubček sought to put a new face on socialism through his Prague Spring political reforms, only to see his dreams snuffed out by Soviet-led forces of the Warsaw Pact. In justifying the attack, Brezhnev outlined the so-called Brezhnev Doctrine, in which he claimed the right to violate the sovereignty of any country that turned away from communism. The Soviets had Czechoslovakia, the United States had Vietnam, and both countries had nuclear missiles pointed at the other. The world had grown weary of the Cold War, and pressure was building for change.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
By the time Richard Nixon reached the White House in 1969, the Cold War had been underway for more than 2 decades. The superpowers had reached a crossroads. They could continue the saber-rattling and confrontations that threatened to plunge the world into nuclear war. Or they could agree to disagree and seek areas of mutual interest. In 1969, they chose the latter, and a decade of relative calm in the Cold War began. In Europe, West German Chancellor Willy Brandt called it Ostpolitik. In the United States, Nixon and his National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger called it détente. It did not end the Cold War, but it created a framework for cooperation among the rivals. In 1972, President Nixon embarked on a diplomatic trip that came to symbolize détente. When he touched down at Capitol Airport near Peking, Nixon became the first American president to be welcomed in the Communist People's Republic of China. It was a historic opening in the Cold War. During a week of diplomacy and cultural exchange, 2 former enemies made great progress toward normalizing relations. Not to be outdone, Soviet Union reached out to the West as well. Chairman Leonid Brezhnev saw détente as an opportunity to gain access to valuable foreign aid and open its borders to international trade. In May 1972, the Kremlin in Moscow played host to the American president. Together, Nixon and Brezhnev signed the first-ever agreements to limit nuclear weapons. The SALT I and ABM treaties were largely symbolic, but they represented a mutual effort to work towards cooperation and coexistence. President Nixon appealed to the Soviet people and their leaders.
Dobry večer. As we look at the prospects for peace, we see that we have made significant progress at reducing the possible sources of direct conflict between us. But history tells us that great nations have often been dragged into war without intending it by conflicts between smaller nations. As great powers, we can and should use our influence to prevent this from happening. Our goal should be to discourage aggression in other parts of the world and particularly among those smaller nations that look to us for leadership and example. With great power goes great responsibility.
Nixon's peace offensive was soon overshadowed by the intrigue and cover-ups of the Watergate scandal.
Some of these events in 1969 and 1970 included intensive harassment of political candidates.
Congressional hearings revealed that the president and his staff had waged an illegal war against their political opponents, members of the media, leaders of the anti-war movement. Crimes had been committed. Congress threatened impeachment. For Nixon, it was the end of the line.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Détente continued under President Gerald Ford, notably with the signing of the 1975 Helsinki Final Act. In Helsinki, Finland, President Ford, Chairman Brezhnev, and 33 other world leaders formally acknowledged the post-World War II borders in Europe and recognized the universal significance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Chairman Brezhnev was nervous about the human rights provision, but his foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, reassured him that it was just a piece of paper. President Ford said the issue was a time bomb for the Soviets, for it established an internationally accepted standard by which communist governments could be held accountable for the treatment of its citizens. Emboldened by this legal and moral authority, thousands of freedom-loving individuals challenged the governments that enslaved them. Helsinki watch groups monitored human rights abuses behind the Iron Curtain and brought them to world attention. Many activists were targeted by official government harassment. In 1977, the Soviet Union's secret police service, the KGB, reported that it had investigated members of the Moscow-Helsinki Watch and uncovered slanderous materials and hostile documents that could inflict serious political damage on the Soviet state. The report was signed by KGB chief Yuri Andropov. The campaigns were not limited to the Soviet Union. In communist Czechoslovakia, a small group of dissidents drafted a human rights manifesto called the Charter 77 Declaration. It petitioned the Czech government to live up to the promises it had made at Helsinki. The government denounced the signatories and retaliated. Playwright Václav Havel was among the many Chartists who were arrested and imprisoned for subversion and hostility towards the socialist state. In 1979, the wave of defiance crested. The leader of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope John Paul II, brought a message of hope to his native Poland. He reassured the millions of Poles who greeted him, "Be not afraid. You must be strong with the strength of hope." The Pope became a powerful force for change in communist Poland. He became a chief supporter of Solidarność, or Solidarity, an independent trade union led by Lech Walesa, the first ever to be established in a communist bloc country. In the United States, a new president, Jimmy Carter, made human rights the centerpiece of his new administration.
The passion for freedom is on the rise. Tapping this new spirit, there can be no nobler nor more ambitious task for America to undertake on this day of a new beginning than to help shape a just and peaceful world that is truly humane.
President Carter spent 3 years working in vain to further the cause of world peace and to bring an end to the Cold War. By the end of his term, the Soviet Union's arsenal equaled that of the U.S., and America's world supremacy was being openly challenged. In 1979, America's old ally in the Middle East, the Shah of Iran, was forced from power during the Iranian Revolution. 9 months later, student followers of the Shiite cleric Ayatollah Khomeini stormed the American embassy. Scores of Americans were taken captive and held for more than a year. The hostage crisis, coupled with the shifting balance in the Cold War, convinced many Americans that their nation had lost its international power and prestige. Then on Christmas Day 1979, the Soviets struck a fatal blow to détente when they invaded Afghanistan to prop up a failing Marxist dictatorship. Détente had taken the chill off of the Cold War, but it had never been a solution to the deep-seated hostilities that caused it. By 1980, the temperature was falling, and sabers were unsheathed. New actors waited in the wings as the stage was set for the final, decisive battle of the Cold War.
The only morality they recognize is what will further their cause.
By 1980, Ronald Reagan's crusade against communism had spanned 5 decades.
The crusade for freedom is your chance and mine to fight communism.
In 1947, he was the B-movie actor who railed against communist infiltration of Hollywood. 20 years later, as the governor of California, he defended America's war in Vietnam.
But ending the conflict is not so simple as just calling it off and coming home, because the price for that kind of peace could be 1,000 years of darkness for generations yet unborn.
In 1981, communism's old foe assumed a powerful new position. Just like in the movies, America's new president was ready for the final showdown.
We must realize that no arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have. It is a weapon that we as Americans do have. Let that be understood by those who practice terrorism and prey upon their neighbors.
The Cold War balance of power had shifted dramatically in favor of the Soviet Union during the 1970s. Reagan vowed to change that. He made no secret of his desire to destroy communism.
The West won't contain communism. It'll transcend communism. It won't bother to denounce it. It will dismiss it as some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written.
While critics cautioned against inciting the Russian bear, the Reagan administration made plans to win the Cold War. National Security Directive 75 outlined a strategy to reinvigorate the nation's military defense and encourage political change within the Soviet sphere. Only then, from a position of strength, not weakness, would the U.S. engage in diplomacy. President Reagan's defense proposal was bold and controversial. It called for an investment of $1.5 trillion over 5 years, the greatest military buildup ever in peacetime. New ships, tanks, fighter jets, and nuclear weapons for the American arsenal. And nuclear-tipped Pershing II missiles to strengthen America's NATO allies in Europe.
We must stand by all our democratic allies, and we must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent from Afghanistan to Nicaragua to defy Soviet-supported aggression and secure rights which have been ours from birth.
In a policy known as the Reagan Doctrine, the president asserted America's right to support those who opposed communism wherever they might be. Breaking with the doctrine of containment, which had ruled U.S.-Soviet relations for decades, the Reagan Doctrine was designed to roll back communism. American military aid flowed to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua and other anti-communist resistance groups. The president authorized billions of dollars in arms for Mujahideen guerrillas battling Soviet troops in Afghanistan. With the help of American-made Stinger missiles, the ragtag militia turned the tide against the mighty Soviet army. While these far-flung conflicts became bleeding wounds for the Soviet Union, American aid bankrolled the human rights movement behind the Iron Curtain.
It is the democratic countries that are prosperous and responsive to the needs of their people.
Before the British Parliament, President Reagan made a bold prediction.
What I'm describing now is a plan and a hope for the long term. The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people.
By the end of his first term in office, defense spending reached $34 million per hour. The president said he was arming to disarm. An increasingly vocal minority said he was mad. The nuclear freeze movement argued that the president was leading the world toward nuclear war. 1 million freeze supporters converged on Central Park in 1982 to denounce the arms buildup.
We want no more nuclear weapons!
Reagan maintained that they had misjudged his intentions. He wanted to end communism, not the world, and he had a plan to do it.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
In March 1983, President Reagan proposed the creation of a space-based missile defense known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. The concept read like science fiction. Satellites patrolling the heavens, zapping incoming Soviet missiles with lasers.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
The press quickly dubbed the controversial plan Star Wars. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov denounced the American president for inventing new plans on how to unleash a nuclear war. Star Wars was decades from becoming a reality, but the Soviets saw it as an immediate threat. The Soviet Union was stretched to the breaking point. Fully half of its economic output was needed to keep pace with Reagan's arms buildup. They had neither the money nor the technological know-how to join the race for a space-based missile shield. Just months after the Star Wars announcement, an international crisis dramatized the sinister nature of what Reagan called the evil empire.
My fellow Americans, I'm coming before you tonight about the Korean airline massacre. The attack by the Soviet Union against 269 innocent men, women, and children aboard an unarmed Korean passenger plane.
In August 1983, Soviet air defenses shot down a commercial airliner that had drifted off course.
This was the Soviet Union against the world and the moral precepts which guide human relations among people everywhere.
It was a military blunder. Reagan asserted otherwise.
It was an act of barbarism, born of a society which wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life and seeks constantly to expand and dominate other nations.
As Reagan's rhetoric reached a fever pitch, Andropov became convinced that the United States was preparing for a surprise nuclear attack on the USSR. When Reagan learned this, he was astonished. Do you suppose they really believe that? I don't see how they could believe that, but it's something to think about. The superpowers managed to avoid nuclear Armageddon for nearly 4 decades, but on November 20th, 1983, millions of Americans endured the unthinkable. The TV movie The Day After was a fictionalized depiction of nuclear war. But for President Reagan, it was a sobering glimpse at where the world might be headed.
More than 20 years ago, President Kennedy defined an approach that is as valid today as when he announced it. So let us not be blind to our differences, he said, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved.
Reagan decided he had pushed hard enough. It was time to try a new approach.
People don't make wars. People want to raise their children in a world without fear and without war. If the Soviet government wants peace, then there will be peace. Together, we can strengthen peace, reduce the level of arms, and know in doing so that we have helped fulfill the hopes and dreams of those we represent, and indeed of people everywhere. Let us begin now. Thank you.
President Reagan's about-face, from warmonger to peacemaker, coincided with the death of the third Soviet leader in as many years. Reagan joked, "How can I get anywhere with the Soviets if they keep dying on me?" At 54 years of age, the new communist in charge was in no immediate danger of dying. Mikhail Gorbachev was university educated, reform-minded, with ideas and imagination. He seemed quite unlike the sinister, boorish, senile leaders who had preceded him. Gorbachev was determined to save the failing Soviet economic system and improve the lives of ordinary citizens without abandoning Marxism-Leninism. In November 1986, Gorbachev and Reagan met for the first time at a summit in Geneva, Switzerland. The mood was tense during official discussions. Gorbachev was ready to negotiate an arms reduction on condition that Reagan abandon Star Wars. The president wouldn't budge. But in private, the two leaders forged the beginnings of a personal relationship that would transcend ideology, geopolitical differences, and the Cold War itself. Geneva did not produce any arms limitation agreements, but it provided a historic breakthrough. Just 5 months later, an explosion ripped through reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union. It was an environmental catastrophe, the worst nuclear disaster in history. It exposed a Soviet system that was shot through with corruption and incompetence. Gorbachev vowed immediate and radical change. The Soviet leader introduced glasnost, a move away from government secrecy toward openness, and perestroika, a dramatic economic, political, and social restructuring of the Soviet Union itself. To pay for the reforms, Gorbachev knew he would have to abandon the arms race and seek an end to the Cold War. In December 1987, the seeds planted at Geneva a year earlier bore fruit. Reagan and Gorbachev signed a historic agreement to eliminate intermediate-range missiles in Europe. It was the first step on the road to dramatically reducing nuclear weapons stockpiles. Reagan and Gorbachev found common ground on the issue of nuclear abolition. In 1987, President Reagan traveled to West Germany to seek common ground on human rights. In front of the Berlin Wall, he made his appeal.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
For Ronald Reagan, the one-time Hollywood actor, it may have been his finest performance.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
Even as President Reagan spoke at the Berlin Wall in 1987, the last great drama of the Cold War was unfolding. For decades, the repression of Eastern Europe had been backed up by the threat of Soviet military force. But in 1988, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev announced an end to that policy. At the United Nations, he declared, "Force cannot be an instrument of foreign policy. Freedom of choice is a universal principle, and it should know no exceptions." Hardline communists throughout the Eastern Bloc were powerless to stop what came next. The citizens of one country after another rose up against communist domination. Hungary led the way. In June 1989, the Hungarian government held a state funeral to honor and rebury the martyred figurehead of the 1956 uprising, Imre Nagy. 200,000 Hungarians attended. At the same time, Hungary opened its border with Austria, opening a gateway in the Iron Curtain. When news reached East Germany, tens of thousands packed up their belongings and made the 800-kilometer journey to freedom. In Poland, free elections were held, and solidarity prevailed. Lech Walesa was chosen to lead the first non-communist government in post-war Eastern Europe. In Czechoslovakia, hundreds of thousands mobbed the streets, demanding that the government step down. By the end of the year, Alexander Dubček, whose 1968 Prague Spring reforms had been crushed by Soviet tanks, was installed as chairman of the National Assembly. Alongside him was Czechoslovakia's new president, playwright turned dissident turned politician, Václav Havel. In Bulgaria, the Communist Party was renounced and forced to hold free and fair elections.
Free and democratic elections to be held next year.
Only in Romania was the revolution bloody. The most brutal of communist dictators, Nicolae Ceausescu, clung tenaciously to power, only to be deposed, arrested, and then executed on Christmas Day, 1989. Across the country, the Soviet emblem was torn from the Romanian flag in celebration of their newly won independence. In East Germany, the hardliner Erich Honecker was forced to resign. Despite promising democratic reforms, the new government was unable to contain the popular uprising. After nearly 30 years, the Berlin Wall was breached. Within a year, the future of divided Germany was settled once and for all. In 1990, the country was united, and the German people voted to establish a single democratic government. As the Eastern Bloc disintegrated, Mikhail Gorbachev refused to intervene. He was hailed as a hero by those outside his country. At home, he was ridiculed during the country's annual May Day parade. The Soviet Union had lost its international prestige. Perestroika had failed to revive the economy. And the individual republics that comprised the vast Soviet state demanded their independence. Ultimately, the force of change that had swept through Eastern Europe engulfed the Soviet Union as well, and consumed the man who had set them in motion. On Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, in his final act as head of state, officially dissolved the Soviet Union. The Cold War was over.